The morning air cut through David Martinez's thin jacket like a blade as he walked down the empty street. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the small town of Cedar Falls in a thick white silence that seemed to muffle even his footsteps. At 62, David had learned to move carefully on icy sidewalks, but his worn-out boots offered little grip against the slippery surface. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The last of his unemployment benefits had run out weeks ago, and the part-time job at the hardware store had ended when the owner decided he couldn't afford extra help during the slow winter months. David's landlord had been patient, but patience only stretched so far. The eviction notice tucked into his coat pocket felt heavier than the snow accumulating on his shoulders. The shelter downtown had been full for weeks. Every night, David had stood in line with dozens of other people, watching as the volunteers shook their heads apologetically when they reached him. Maybe tomorrow, they always said, but tomorrow never seemed to come. He had spent the last 4 nights sleeping in the abandoned bus station, huddled behind a broken vending machine that provided some protection from the wind. As David turned the corner onto Maple Street, his legs began to shake. The weakness had been building for days, a hollow feeling that started in his stomach and spread through his entire body. He had tried to ignore it, focusing instead on finding food or shelter or work, but his body was beginning to betray him. Each step required more effort than the last, and the simple act of breathing in the cold air made his chest ache. He thought about his daughter Sarah, living 3 states away with her own family. They had spoken 6 months ago, a brief conversation filled with awkward silences and careful questions about his job situation. She had offered to send money, but David's pride had gotten in the way. He had assured her everything was fine, that he was managing just fine on his own. Now, as he struggled to put one foot in front of the other, he wondered if pride was worth freezing to death over. The snow was coming down harder now, thick flakes that stuck to his eyelashes and made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. David squinted through the white curtain, trying to remember which direction led to the community center. Maybe they had a warm place where he could sit for a while, or perhaps someone there would know of a job opening or a place to stay. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, maybe a crack in the sidewalk or a piece of broken concrete. David felt himself falling forward, his arms windmilling as he tried to catch his balance. Time seemed to slow as he realized he wasn't going to recover, wasn't going to stay upright. His body hit the ground hard, his shoulder taking most of the impact as he rolled into a small snowdrift beside the sidewalk. For a moment, David lay still, taking inventory of his body. His shoulder throbbed, but nothing seemed broken. The real problem was that he couldn't seem to summon the energy to get back up. The snow was cold against his face, but after the initial shock, it almost felt comfortable. His eyelids grew heavy as the exhaustion of the past weeks caught up with him all at once. The street was completely empty. Most people were smart enough to stay inside during a storm like this, warm in their houses with full refrigerators and working heaters. David had walked these same streets for years when he had a job and a place to live, never really noticing the people who might be struggling just to survive each day. Now he was one of them, invisible to the world that moved around him. As he lay in the snow, David's mind drifted to better times. He remembered working construction for 23 years, the satisfaction of building something solid and permanent with his own hands. He thought about the small apartment he had shared with his wife Maria before she passed away 5 years ago, how they would sit together on winter evenings watching old movies and drinking hot chocolate. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, a different person who lived in a different world. The cold was seeping through his clothes, but David found it increasingly difficult to care. His thoughts became fuzzy around the edges, and he realized he was probably going into hypothermia. He had read about it once in a magazine at the doctor's office, how the body shuts down gradually to preserve the vital organs. Maybe this was how it would end, quietly and alone on a snowy street where no one would find him until spring. Cars drove past occasionally, their headlights creating brief pools of yellow light in the storm, but none of them slowed down. Why would they? David was just another lump in the snow, barely visible from the road. He tried to wave once when he heard an engine approaching, but his arm felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and he could barely lift it off the ground. The snow continued to fall, slowly covering his legs and torso like a white blanket. David closed his eyes and tried to think of something warm, something that would take his mind off the cold that was settling deep into his bones. He pictured Maria's smile, the way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes. He imagined Sarah as a little girl, running through sprinklers in their backyard during the summer, her delighted squeals filling the air. Time became meaningless as David drifted in and out of consciousness. He wasn't sure if minutes or hours had passed when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching, crunching through the snow with determined purpose. Someone was walking toward him, but David couldn't open his eyes to see who it might be. His body had gone numb, and he wondered if he was dreaming, or if this was what dying felt like. The footsteps stopped somewhere near his head, and David heard a woman's voice, sharp with concern and alarm. She was talking to him, but the words seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the snow and his own fading consciousness. He tried to respond, to let her know he was still alive, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Then he felt hands on his shoulders, surprisingly strong and warm even through his wet clothes. Someone was trying to help him, trying to pull him back from whatever edge he had been approaching. David managed to open his eyes for just a moment and saw a face looking down at him, framed by the falling snow like an angel in a winter storm. Rebecca Chen had been running late for her shift at the hospital when she spotted what looked like a bundle of old clothes in the snow. As a nurse in the emergency department, she had developed an instinct for recognizing trouble, and something about the way the dark shape was positioned made her stop her car and take a closer look. The snow was falling so heavily that visibility was down to just a few yards, but Rebecca trusted her instincts more than the weather conditions. She pulled her Honda Civic to the curb and grabbed her medical bag from the back seat. Rebecca never went anywhere without it, a habit that had saved lives more times than she could count. As she approached the figure in the snow, her heart began racing. This wasn't a pile of discarded clothing at all. This was a person, and from the way he was lying motionless, he was in serious trouble. Kneeling beside David, Rebecca quickly assessed his condition. His lips were blue, his breathing was shallow, and his skin felt dangerously cold even through his wet clothes. She had seen hypothermia cases before, but this man was closer to death than most patients who made it to the hospital. His pulse was weak and irregular, and when she called his name, his response was barely coherent mumbling. Rebecca knew she had to act fast. Moving David to her car would be risky in his condition, but leaving him in the snow would be fatal. She managed to get her arms under his shoulders and lift him partially upright, surprised by how light he felt. Malnutrition, she realized, adding another layer of concern to an already critical situation. This man hadn't just been caught in the storm, he had been struggling for survival long before the snow started falling. Getting David into her car required all of Rebecca's strength and determination. He was conscious enough to help slightly, but his movements were uncoordinated and weak. She half carried, half dragged him to the passenger seat, then cranked up the heat as high as it would go. David slumped against the window, his breathing creating small patches of fog on the glass. During the drive to Mercy General Hospital, Rebecca kept one eye on the road and one on her passenger. She had called ahead to the emergency department, alerting them to expect a severe hypothermia case, but she was worried David might not survive the 10-minute drive. His shivering had stopped completely, which was actually a bad sign. When the body stopped trying to warm itself, it usually meant the organs were beginning to shut down. "What's your name?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep David conscious through conversation. He turned his head slowly toward her, his eyes struggling to focus. "David," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the heater. "David Martinez. I'm Rebecca. You're going to be okay, David. We're almost to the hospital." She wasn't sure if she believed her own words, but hope was sometimes the only medicine available in situations like this. "I was just trying to find somewhere warm," David mumbled, his words slurring together. The shelter was full. Always full. Rebecca felt her heart clench. She had heard similar stories too many times before. People falling through the cracks of an overburdened system, invisible until they ended up in the emergency room or worse. "When did you last eat?" she asked gently. David was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he might have lost consciousness again. Then he spoke so softly she almost missed it. 2 days. Maybe 3. Hard to remember. The emergency department team was waiting when Rebecca pulled up to the ambulance entrance. She had worked with these people for 8 years, and they moved together like a well-rehearsed dance. Within minutes, David was on a gurney, hooked up to monitors, and surrounded by medical professionals who were fighting to save his life. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, ran through the standard hypothermia protocols while Rebecca filled him in on what she had observed. David's core body temperature was dangerously low, and his blood sugar levels were critically depleted. They started warming him slowly, knowing that raising his temperature too quickly could cause cardiac arrest. As the medical team worked, Rebecca found herself unable to leave David's side. She had saved lives before. It was part of her job. But something about this man's situation had affected her differently. Maybe it was the way he had apologized for causing trouble when they were inserting his IV, or the fact that he had no emergency contacts when they asked for next of kin information. "Do you have any family we can call?" Rebecca asked when David was stable enough to answer questions clearly. David turned his head away, embarrassment clear on his face. "My daughter, Sarah, but she lives in Oregon. She has her own family to worry about. I don't want to be a burden." Rebecca understood that kind of pride. She had seen it in her own father, when he had struggled with unemployment during her childhood. Sometimes the people who needed help the most were the least likely to ask for it. "What about friends? Someone local who might be worried about you?" "Not really," David admitted. "I've been pretty much on my own since Maria died." "That's my wife. She passed 5 years ago." Over the next several hours, as David's condition gradually improved, Rebecca learned more about his story. He had been a construction worker for most of his adult life, building houses and commercial buildings throughout the region. He had owned his own small home, nothing fancy but a place where he and Maria had built a life together. When she died from cancer, the medical bills had consumed their savings, and David had been forced to sell the house to pay off the debt. He had managed to find a small apartment and keep working for a few more years, but the construction industry had taken a hit during the economic downturn. Younger workers were willing to accept lower wages, and at his age, David found it increasingly difficult to compete. The part-time jobs he could find barely covered rent, let alone food and utilities. "I tried to apply for assistance," David explained, his voice growing stronger as his body warmed up. "But the waiting lists are so long, and the paperwork is complicated. I'm not very good with computers, and everything is online now. I kept thinking I would find another job before things got really bad." Rebecca nodded, understanding how quickly circumstances could spiral out of control. She had seen it happen to patients before, people who went from stable working lives to homelessness in a matter of months. The safety net that was supposed to catch people in David's situation was full of holes, and too many people fell through. As David's blood work came back and his vital signs stabilized, Dr. Harrison approached Rebecca with a concerned expression. "Physically, he's going to recover," the doctor said quietly. "But Rebecca, we can't just discharge him back to the streets. He'll be dead within a week if this weather continues." Rebecca looked through the window at the snow, which was still falling steadily. The weather forecast called for the storm to continue for at least 2 more days, with temperatures staying well below freezing. "David might survive this night, but what about tomorrow night? Or the night after that?" "The shelter is still full?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. "Completely packed, with a waiting list 50 people long. And honestly, even if a bed opened up, he needs more than just a place to sleep. He needs proper nutrition, medical monitoring, and time to regain his strength." Rebecca stared at David's sleeping form, his face peaceful for the first time since she had found him in the snow. An idea was beginning to form in her mind, something that went against hospital policy and probably violated several professional boundaries. But as she watched this man who had nearly died alone and forgotten, Rebecca realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Rebecca spent her entire break sitting in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The idea that had been forming in her mind seemed both completely logical and totally insane. She owned a small house on the outskirts of town, a 2-bedroom place she had inherited from her grandmother 3 years earlier. The guest room had been sitting empty ever since, filled with boxes of old medical textbooks and nursing journals she couldn't bring herself to throw away. The practical part of her brain listed all the reasons why bringing David home was a terrible idea. She barely knew this man. Hospital policies strictly prohibited staff from developing personal relationships with patients. Her neighbors might ask questions. What if David was dangerous or had addiction problems or mental health issues she wasn't equipped to handle? But the human part of her brain, The part that had driven her to become a nurse in the first place kept showing her the image of David lying in the snow, nearly dead because there was nowhere else for him to go. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent her final years volunteering at soup kitchens and homeless shelters, always saying that helping people wasn't something you did when it was convenient, but when it was necessary. When Rebecca returned to David's room, she found him sitting up in bed looking remarkably better than he had just hours earlier. The color had returned to his face and his eyes were clear and alert. He was staring out the window at the continuing snowfall with an expression that mixed relief with deep worry. "How are you feeling?" Rebecca asked, checking his chart and noting that his temperature had returned to normal. "Much better, thanks to you," David replied, his voice sincere. "The doctor said you found me in the snow. You saved my life." Rebecca pulled up a chair beside his bed, an action that made David look concerned. In his experience, when medical staff sat down for conversations, the news was usually bad. "David, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. When you leave here, where will you go?" David's expression darkened and he looked down at his hands. "I'll figure something out. Maybe the shelter will have an opening by then, or the storm will pass and it won't be so cold. But if the shelter is still full and the weather doesn't improve," David was quiet for a long moment. "Then I guess I'll have to take my chances. I made it this far, right?" Rebecca leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "David, you nearly died tonight. If I hadn't found you when I did, you would have frozen to death in that snow. Taking your chances isn't really an option anymore." "I know," David whispered, and Rebecca could see tears forming in his eyes. "I just don't know what else to do. I've tried everything I can think of. The social services office, the churches, the community organizations. Everyone wants to help, but there are so many people in need and not enough resources to go around." Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change both their lives. "What if I told you there was another option? Something temporary, just until you could get back on your feet?" David looked up, confusion clear on his face. "I don't understand. I have a guest room in my house. It's not much, but it's warm and safe. And there's a decent kitchen where you could cook proper meals. You could stay there while we work on finding you a permanent solution." The silence that followed was so complete that Rebecca could hear the monitors beeping in the next room. David stared at her as if she had just spoken in a foreign language, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. "You don't even know me," he finally said. "Why would you do something like that for a complete stranger?" Rebecca had asked herself the same question dozens of times over the past few hours. "Because someone needs to," she said simply. "And because I can. It's not a permanent solution, but it might give us time to figure out something better." "I couldn't possibly accept something like that," David protested, his pride warring with his desperation. "You've already done too much. I'm not your responsibility." "You're right, you're not my responsibility," Rebecca agreed. "But you're a human being who deserves a chance to survive, and right now I'm in a position to help make that happen. It doesn't have to be charity if it makes you feel better about it. You could help with household repairs, cooking, whatever you're comfortable with." David was quiet again, and Rebecca could see him struggling with the decision. She understood how difficult it must be for someone who had been independent his entire adult life to accept help from a stranger, but she also knew that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "How do you know I'm not dangerous?" David asked finally. "How do you know I won't steal from you or hurt you? You really don't know anything about me?" Rebecca smiled for the first time that day. "David, in the few hours I've known you, you've apologized for causing trouble when we were saving your life. You've been concerned about being a burden to your daughter, and you've tried to refuse help even though accepting it might be the difference between life and death. Those aren't the actions of someone I need to be afraid of." Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, interrupting their conversation. "How's our patient doing?" he asked, noting David's improved appearance. "Much better," Rebecca replied. "We were just discussing discharge plans." Dr. Harrison nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "Medically, he's stable enough to leave. But Rebecca, you know as well as I do that sending him back out into this weather would be essentially a death sentence. The temperature is supposed to drop another 10 degrees tonight." Rebecca looked at David, who was staring at his hands again. "That's been taken care of," she said quietly. "He won't be going back to the streets." Dr. Harrison raised an eyebrow but didn't ask for details. In his 20 years of emergency medicine, he had learned that sometimes the best solutions came from unexpected places. "Well, that's good news. I'll start the discharge paperwork." After the doctor left, David looked up at Rebecca with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that looked like fear. "Are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once I accept your help, I'm not going to be able to repay you for a long time. Maybe never." Rebecca stood up and moved toward the window, looking out at the snow that continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. She thought about all the patients she had seen over the years, people who had been in David's situation or worse. She had always wondered what happened to them after they left the hospital, whether they found the help they needed or simply disappeared back into the streets where their problems would inevitably get worse. "David," she said, turning back to face him, "I've been a nurse for 8 years. I've seen hundreds of people come through these doors with problems that could have been prevented if someone had stepped in earlier. Tonight I have the chance to be that someone. I can't save everyone, but maybe I can save you." David wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Rebecca replied. "Say yes, and let's see if we can figure out how to put your life back together." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time in months, David Martinez wasn't afraid of spending the night in the cold. Someone had stopped to help him, someone who saw him as more than just another invisible person on the street. As he lay back against the hospital pillows, David allowed himself to hope that maybe his story wasn't over after all. 6 months after that snowy night when Rebecca found David collapsed on Maple Street, she sat in the audience of the Cedar Falls Community Center, watching him receive a certificate of completion from the county's job training program. David looked completely different from the man she had pulled from the snow, not just physically healthier, but radiating a confidence and sense of purpose that had been absent for so long. The transitional housing program had been exactly what David needed. It provided him with a small apartment, job training in building maintenance and repair, and most importantly, a community of people who understood his struggles because they had faced similar challenges themselves. Rebecca had visited him there several times, impressed by the supportive environment and the genuine care the staff showed for their residents. David's reference letter from Rebecca had indeed helped move him up the waiting list, but his own determination and work ethic had carried him through the program. He had excelled in the job training courses, drawing on his decades of construction experience while learning new skills in areas like HVAC repair and electrical work. His instructors praised his reliability, his willingness to help other students, and his positive attitude despite everything he had been through. After the graduation ceremony, David approached Rebecca with a smile that reminded her why she had decided to help him in the first place. "I have something to tell you," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "I got the job." Rebecca hugged him, genuinely thrilled by the news. For the past month, David had been interviewing for a position as a maintenance supervisor at a local apartment complex. It was exactly the kind of work he enjoyed, and the pay would be enough for him to afford his own apartment while still having something left over to begin rebuilding his savings. "The manager said my references were outstanding," David continued, grinning at Rebecca. "Apparently someone wrote a letter describing me as reliable, hardworking, and completely trustworthy. I can't imagine who that might have been." They walked together to a small coffee shop near the community center, a place that had become their regular spot for these kinds of conversations. Over the past 6 months, their relationship had evolved from emergency assistance to genuine friendship. Rebecca had learned as much from David as he had from her, gaining a deeper understanding of resilience, humility, and the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than statistics. "There's something else," David said as they settled into their usual corner booth. "I called Sarah yesterday. My daughter. I told her everything that happened, about losing my apartment, about living on the streets, about nearly dying in the snow. But I also told her about you and about how I'm getting my life back together." Rebecca raised her eyebrows, surprised. David had mentioned his daughter several times over the months, but he had been reluctant to contact her, still embarrassed about how far he had fallen. "How did she take it?" Rebecca asked. "Better than I expected," David admitted. "She cried, of course. She was angry that I hadn't called her sooner, angry that I had let pride keep me from asking for help when I really needed it. But she was also proud of me for getting through it, for accepting help when it was offered, and for working so hard to get back on my feet." David pulled out his phone and showed Rebecca a photo that had arrived that morning. It showed Sarah with her husband and 2 young children, all of them holding a sign that read, "We love you," Grandpa. Rebecca felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that David's recovery had reconnected him, not just with his sense of self-worth, but with his family. She wants to visit next month, David continued. She wants to meet you to thank you for what you did. I told her you probably saved more than just my life that night. You saved our whole family from losing each other forever. As they talked, Rebecca reflected on how much her own life had changed since that snowy evening 6 months ago. David's presence in her house had reminded her of what her grandmother had always believed, that helping others wasn't just about making their lives better, it was about making your own life more meaningful. The experience had inspired Rebecca to volunteer with the county's homeless outreach program, using her medical skills to provide basic health care to people living on the streets. I have some news too, Rebecca said. Remember how we talked about the gaps in the system? About how many people fall through the cracks because there aren't enough resources, or because the existing programs are hard to navigate? David nodded, recalling many conversations they had shared about the broader problems that had contributed to his situation. Well, I've been working with some other people at the hospital and in the community to start a new program. It's going to be called the Emergency Bridge Initiative. The idea is to provide immediate temporary housing and support services for people in crisis situations, like what you went through. We're going to bridge the gap between emergency care and long-term programs. David stared at her for a moment, then shook his head with amazement. You're going to do for other people what you did for me. We're going to try, Rebecca confirmed. The city council approved the funding last week and we've identified a location. We should be able to help our first clients within the next few months. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both thinking about the unlikely journey that had brought them to this point. Rebecca had set out that snowy evening simply trying to get to work on time. She had ended up saving a life, making a friend, and discovering a calling that would shape the rest of her career. David had been prepared to die alone and forgotten in the snow. Instead, he had found not just rescue, but renewal. You know what the strangest part is? David said finally. I spent months feeling invisible, feeling like I didn't matter to anyone. But that night in the snow, when you stopped to help me, I realized that I had been looking at it all wrong. What do you mean? Rebecca asked. I thought I was invisible because people weren't helping me, David explained. But the truth is, people were seeing me all along. They were just choosing to look away. You were the first person who chose to look closer instead of looking away. That choice, that split-second decision to stop and investigate instead of driving past, that's what made all the difference. Rebecca considered this, thinking about all the times in her own life when she had been faced with similar choices. How many opportunities to help had she missed because she was too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to get involved? How many David Martinez's had she passed by without even realizing they needed assistance? I think about that night a lot, she admitted. About what would have happened if I had been 5 minutes earlier or later, if I had been in a hurry and not noticed you, if I had assumed someone else would stop to help. The timing had to be exactly right for things to work out the way they did. Maybe, David said, or maybe it was just meant to happen this way. Maria used to say that God puts people in each other's paths at exactly the right moments, but only if they're paying attention. You were paying attention, Rebecca. That's what made you different from everyone else who drove past me that night. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, David reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wrapped package. I have something for you, he said, looking slightly embarrassed. It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember this whole experience. Rebecca unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small wooden box with an intricate carving on the lid. The carving showed two figures helping each other up a mountain path, their hands clasped together as they climbed toward the summit. I made it in the woodworking class at the community center, David explained. The instructor said I had a natural talent for it, that I should think about doing more woodworking in my spare time. But I wanted this piece to go to you. Rebecca traced the carved figures with her finger, moved by the craftsmanship and the thought behind the gift. David, this is beautiful. But you know what the real gift has been? Getting to know you. Getting to see how strong and resilient you are. Getting to be part of your comeback story. 6 months earlier, David Martinez had been lying in the snow, forgotten by the world and forgotten by himself. Tonight he would sleep in his own apartment, surrounded by the tools and equipment for a job that would give him security and purpose. Tomorrow he would begin a new chapter of his life, one built on the foundation of human kindness and the simple recognition that everyone deserves a chance to start over. Rebecca Chen had stopped on a snowy street because something looked wrong, because her instincts told her to investigate rather than assume. That decision had saved a life, but it had also changed her own understanding of what it meant to be part of a community, to be responsible for the welfare of the people around her. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of compassion. Sometimes one person stopping to help can alter the trajectory of two lives forever. And sometimes, in the middle of the worst storm, unexpected warmth can be found in the simple recognition that no one should have to face their struggles alone. The drive to Rebecca's house was quiet except for the sound of snow hitting the windshield and the gentle hum of the heater. David sat in the passenger seat, still wearing the hospital scrubs they had given him since his own clothes had been too damaged by the cold and wet to salvage. He stared out the window at the suburban neighborhood, taking in the warm lights glowing from behind curtained windows, the driveways cleared of snow, the general sense of security and stability that he had almost forgotten existed. Rebecca's house was a modest two-story colonial with green shutters and a small front porch. Even in the storm, David could see that it was well-maintained, with careful landscaping and a sense of pride and ownership that reminded him of his own home from years ago. As they pulled into the driveway, he felt a strange mixture of gratitude and shame. This woman had not only saved his life but was now opening her home to him, while he had nothing to offer in return. "It's not much," Rebecca said as she led him up the front steps. "But it's warm and dry, and that's what matters right now." The inside of the house was exactly what David had expected from Rebecca, neat and comfortable without being fancy. The living room had a couch and chairs that looked like they were actually used rather than just for show. Bookshelves lined with medical texts and novels, and family photos scattered on various surfaces. David noticed several pictures of an elderly Asian woman who shared Rebecca's warm smile. "That's my grandmother," Rebecca explained, following his gaze. "She left me this house when she passed away. She would have loved having someone to help. Grandma was always bringing home strays, both animal and human." Rebecca showed David to the guest room upstairs, a small but comfortable space with a single bed, a dresser and a window that looked out over the backyard. She had clearly spent some time preparing the room while he was being discharged from the hospital, moving boxes and making up the bed with fresh sheets. "The bathroom is right across the hall," she explained. "There are towels and basic toiletries in there. I picked up a few changes of clothes from the thrift store on my way home. Just basics until we can get you something better." David sat heavily on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of a clean, warm room. "Rebecca, I need you to understand something. I'm not used to accepting charity. I've worked since I was 16 years old, and I've always taken care of myself and my family. This is very difficult for me." Rebecca sat in the chair by the window, her expression understanding. "I get that, David. But this doesn't have to be charity if you don't want it to be. I've been meaning to get some work done around this place for months. The kitchen faucet leaks, there's a loose board on the front steps, and I've been putting off cleaning out the basement forever. If you're up for it, you could help with projects like that." David nodded, feeling slightly better about the arrangement. "I can do that. I'm good with my hands, always have been. What about food, utilities, things like that?" "Let's not worry about money right now," Rebecca said gently. "The most important thing is getting you healthy and stable. Once we do that, we can figure out the next steps together." Over the next few days, as the storm finally cleared and life in Cedar Falls began to return to normal, David and Rebecca settled into an unexpected routine. David would wake up early and make coffee, a small gesture that Rebecca appreciated after her long shifts at the hospital. He fixed the leaky faucet on his second day, replaced the loose board on the front steps, and began organizing the cluttered basement. But more than the physical improvements to the house, David began to improve himself. Regular meals and a warm place to sleep worked wonders for his physical health. But the psychological impact was even more significant. For the first time in months, he wasn't spending every waking moment worrying about where he would sleep or when he might eat next. His mind, freed from the constant stress of survival, began to function clearly again. Rebecca was surprised by how much she enjoyed having company in the house. Since her grandmother's death, the place had felt too big and too quiet. David was respectful of her space and privacy, but his presence made the house feel alive again. He would have dinner ready when she came home from work, and they would sit at the kitchen table talking about their days. Current events or memories from their respective pasts. "Tell me about Maria," Rebecca said one evening as they shared a simple dinner of pasta and salad that David had prepared. David's face softened at the mention of his wife's name. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. When she got sick, she never complained, never felt sorry for herself. She was more worried about what would happen to me after she was gone than she was about her own pain." "Were you married long?" 31 years. "We met when we were both working at the same diner. She was a waitress and I was doing some construction work on their kitchen. I used to come in every day for coffee just to see her smile." David paused, lost in the memory. "She always said I was too proud for my own good, that I needed to learn to accept help from people who cared about me." Rebecca smiled. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She would have liked you," David said quietly. "She always said that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when it was easy, but what they did when it was hard. What you did for me, taking me in like this, that's the kind of thing Maria would have done without even thinking about it." As the days passed, Rebecca began to understand more about David's situation and the systemic problems that had led to his homelessness. He wasn't lazy or irresponsible. He wasn't addicted to drugs or alcohol, and he wasn't mentally ill. He was simply a man who had been hit by a series of circumstances beyond his control, and who had fallen through the gaps in a system that was supposed to help people like him. The hardest part, David explained one evening, wasn't being poor or hungry or cold. The hardest part was becoming invisible. When you're homeless, people look right through you like you don't exist. They cross the street to avoid walking past you. They pretend not to hear when you ask for help. They treat you like you're somehow less human than they are. Rebecca had seen this phenomenon at the hospital. The way some staff members interacted differently with patients who appeared to be homeless or indigent. She had always tried to treat everyone with the same level of respect and care, but she realized now that she hadn't fully understood the psychological impact of that kind of systematic dehumanization. "But you stopped," David continued. "When everyone else drove past me in the snow, you stopped and looked closely enough to see that I was a person who needed help. That moment when you knelt down beside me and I heard your voice was the first time in months that I felt like I mattered to someone." Rebecca found herself thinking more and more about the broader implications of David's story. How many other people were out there right now, struggling to survive in situations that could be prevented with relatively small interventions? How many David Martinezes were falling through the cracks while people like her went about their comfortable lives without really seeing the suffering that existed right in front of them? One evening, about 2 weeks after David had moved in, Rebecca came home from work to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of papers spread out in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his expression a mixture of determination and nervous energy. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next. I can't stay here forever, we both know that. So I've been making some calls, doing some research. I think I might have found a solution, but I'm going to need your help to make it work." Rebecca sat down across from him, curious about what he had discovered. The papers on the table appeared to be job applications and information about various social service programs. "There's a program through the county," David explained, "that provides transitional housing and job training for people in situations like mine. The waiting list is long, but they said if I had a stable address and a reference from someone in the community, they might be able to move me up the list." Rebecca nodded, understanding where this was going. "You want me to be your reference?" "Only if you're comfortable with that," David said quickly. "I know I'm asking a lot and you've already done more than enough. But Rebecca, this could be my chance to get my life back on track, to become self-sufficient again instead of just surviving day to day." Looking at David's hopeful expression, Rebecca realized that this was exactly what she had hoped for when she first brought him home, not just to save his life, but to give him the opportunity to save himself.